Alright, I gotta finish these card reviews so I can actually play the expansion. So this is probably going to be going a little bit quicker than the previous parts. So first up we have Grimestreet Smuggler. I don't expect this card to see too much play. 3 mana 2/4 is pretty weak, and in the classes that can abuse this mechanic I think they just have better buff cards. So I don't expect this card to see too much play. Grimestreet Outfitter, I think this card is actually very good. 2 mana 1/1 is obviously weak, but if you can buff like 3 1-drops and play all of them next turn, that's pretty sick. Or even if you just play the cards throughout the game, it's still pretty good. Right now, Paladin doesn't really have a 2-drop at all, so they just hero power on turn 2, which is just a 1/1 anyway. So this card is just kind of like what you're doing anyway, but you get to buff your entire hand. I think this card is very good and an aggressive Grimy Goons Paladin. Smuggler's Run is obviously pretty similar to the last card we just looked at, except it costs 1 less mana and doesn't have a body. I think the Outfitter is a little bit better than this card, just because you do get the body, but I think this card is probably still good for the same reason as the Outfitter. It's actually pretty sick if you go turn 1 Smuggler's Run into turn 2 Outfitter. Your Outfitter is a 2/2, which is much more acceptable as a turn 2 play, and then everything you drop from there on out is going to have +2/+2. So if you can go Smuggler's Run into Grimestreet Outfitter into like triple 1-drop, that's probably the dream. And you're playing 3 1-drops that all have +2/+2. So I think this card is actually pretty good. I'm not sure if you want 4 copies of Smuggler's Run and Outfitter, so maybe you go like 2 Outfitter, 1 Smuggler's Run, but I think this card is definitely playable. Grimestreet Enforcer is kind of a weird card. It's kind of similar to Emperor Thorison, in that it's understated but has at the end of the turn effect, and if your opponent doesn't kill it, it can snowball pretty hard, and even just 1 tick can be pretty powerful. But I feel like the Paladins give your minions in your hand +1/+1 mechanic is really good on cheaper cards, so that you can give like a bunch of 1 and 2 drops +1/+1, and then flood the board with them the next turn to get like maximum value out of the effect. And this card costs like 5 mana, so I feel like you're not really going to have all those cards in your hand at that point in the game. Maybe you can combine it with like the small time recruits to have a bunch of 1-drops in your hand for the following turn. But that just seems kind of slow, and if you're just getting the +1/+1 on like a couple 3-drops, or like you're just curving it into a 6-drop or something, the effect on this card isn't too strong. But if you can manage to be playing an aggressive Paladin deck that somehow doesn't really lose its hand size, then this card could be very strong. Basically, if you can have a lot of stuff in your hand when you play this card, I think it's pretty good. But I think it's going to be hard to have stuff in your hand, so I don't really expect this card to see too much play. Grimestreet Protector seems like a pretty powerful card to me. It has Taunt, so 7 mana 6/6 Taunt. It's pretty defensive, you can kind of protect yourself from dying with that. But you also give things Divine Shield, so it's like if you have a couple things on the board, you can get some really good trades and prevent them from killing you after you get those good trades. So you can advance your board position with the Divine Shield trades, and you can protect your face from getting smacked the next turn. So this is the kind of card that when played can really just swing the momentum of the game. Paladin decks naturally want to curve up to 8 anyway because Tyrion is such a good card, and there's not really very many good 7-drops you can play, so this guy just kind of fits into the curve. So I think he could definitely see some play. 7 mana 6/6 Taunt is like pretty close to being good enough anyway. So even if you just land the Battle Cry on like a recruit and some other mid-range minion, I think this card is fine. If you go like Tyrion the turn before, and they don't really want to kill it, but they like pop the Divine Shield or something, then you can hero power, play this guy, your Tyrion gets Divine Shield, gets a good trade, and then you have an Argent Squire on the board. A play like that seems pretty strong. The problem is that 7 mana this card is just pretty expensive. You don't want that many expensive cards in your deck, you're already playing Tyrion. At 7 mana specifically, you're competing with Don Honcho, which is also pretty good. So like, it's a powerful card, but maybe you just can't really afford to play it because Paladin has access to better big dudes. But in a vacuum, I think this card is strong. And in a mid-range Paladin deck, I could see this being played as a 1-of. Pretty cool card. Grimscale Chum seems like a very good card to me. Giving a Murloc in your hand +1/+1 is really great, considering this is already a 1 mana 2/1. Generally the Murloc tag is pretty expensive, but you don't really pay that much for it on this card, since it's already kind of an efficiently statted 1-drop. And then buffing the next Murloc you play is also pretty sick, because the Murlocs on their own tend to be kind of vulnerable. and if you can give it just a little bit more health and then it applies a little bit more pressure with that attack, this card is definitely very good. It's just like an efficiently statted 1-drop. It has the Murloc tag, it makes your other Murlocs better. So if Murloc Paladin is a thing, if a non-Anyfin Murloc Paladin is a thing, this card definitely sees play. It's just kind of a matter of, is it going to be a thing? Paladins already have the Vilefin Inquisitor. Murlocs are just generally getting a couple tools this expansion. I'm not sure this guy is quite good enough on his own to make Murloc Paladin a thing, but if it's a thing, this guy will definitely see play in it. And I think there's some potential he's strong enough to make the deck a thing. This is a really good 1-drop in a Murloc deck. Trogg Beastrager seems like a pretty solid 2-drop to me. Hunters obviously want aggressive minions, but they don't really have a good 2-drop. Sometimes they even just play like King Zealot, which is probably going to be less impactful on average than this card. It only buffs beasts, so you're not going to be able to buff certain cards, but it makes it easier to target certain beasts. And given some of the buff synergy cards the Hunter has gotten, I think it's actually a positive that it can only buff beasts. This card itself isn't a beast, so that's an advantage that King Zealot has over this card. But I feel like buffing cards in your hand in Hunter is going to be pretty strong. And in that deck, I think you'd be happy to have a card like Trogg Beastrager. It's not like one of the best cards for the deck, but I think you're just going to want like a certain amount of those effects. And there aren't really that many of the buff effects in Hunter, so I think you just kind of have to play what you can get. So Trogg Beastrager, I mean, it seems alright. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like just not quite good enough, but it seems alright. Hunter has kind of garbage 2-drops, and they want more than Kindly Grandmother in their deck, so probably sees at least some amount of play. Shaky Zipgunner just seems like a very strong card to me. Giving a minion in your hand +2/+2 is really strong, especially considering some of the crazy synergy cards the Hunter gets. 3 mana 3/3 is alright. It does have some N'Zoth synergy too, if you want to take it that route. But I think mostly just 3 mana 3/3 make your Dispatch Kodo or your Rat Pack better. Or even like an Infested Wolf. Pretty much anything you hit with this card is pretty good. And this is like one of the better buff things in hand cards Hunter can play, so I think you're probably going to play it in that deck. Rat Pack just seems like super strong. When you look at the text, you're obviously supposed to be buffing it with things like Shaky Zipgunner, but 3 mana 2/2 summon 2 1/1s is like kinda just good enough on its own. It's somewhere between Haunted Creeper and Infested Wolf, both of which have seen play. So, like, I feel like this card might see play without the potential to summon more rats. But since it can summon more rats, and since it seems to me like the buffing cards in your hand Hunter is going to be a thing, I think this card is definitely going to see play. One issue for this card, and for the Shaky Zipgunner, which I didn't mention, is that the 3-drop slot in Hunter is very strong. Animal Companion, Eaglehorn Bow, Cloaked Huntress, maybe even Desert Camel, Kill Command, Unleash the Hounds. I don't remember what tournament it was. I think it was maybe the Americas qualifier for BlizzCon. There was a player who actually didn't play Animal Companion. The 3-drop slot was just so heavily contested in his deck that he couldn't find room for Animal Companion. So if you can't find room for Animal Companion, maybe these new 3-drops are looking kinda sketchy, but they just both seem so good to me, so I expect Rat Pack and Shaky Zipgunner to probably see play. But if they don't, it's because they're 3-drops for Hunter. Dispatch Kodo seems like another really strong card for Hunter. Obviously people want to compare it to old Keeper of the Grove. From Druid, it used to be a 2/4, and obviously if you choose the 2 damage option, the Dispatch Kodo is pretty similar to Keeper of the Grove. A lot of people have been like, oh yeah, well Keeper of the Grove also had the silence, so that's a difference. Another difference that I haven't really heard too many people mention is that Druid has Innervate and Hunter doesn't. And a lot of the time if you just innervated out a Keeper of the Grove on turn 2 against an aggressive deck, that play could just kind of win you the game. So that's kind of another important difference between these two cards that I haven't heard mentioned. But I still think Dispatch Kodo is a very strong card. Even at 4 mana 2/4, the card is like playable. If you get even a single buff on this card, it's like pretty nuts. And if you can stack multiple buffs on this card, it's like completely broken. And I think it's going to be pretty easy to do that with the buff tools that Hunter got, so the card just seems pretty strong to me. Hunter also doesn't have great 4-drops. They play Infested Wolf. Infested Wolf is a good card, but it's kind of low in power level, I guess. Houndmaster is a good card, but it's kind of situational. And Dispatch Kodo is just very strong. Smuggler's Crate, 1 mana +2/+2 is pretty strong, especially since you can play this on turn 1, and then your 2-drop can be like a 5/4 or something. That means instead of dying for free to Totem Golem, your King's Relic actually beats Totem Golem and lives. And I feel like the Buff Hunter may not want to be playing 1-drops anyway, so this is something you can do on turn 1 in that deck. It's also pretty easy to just work into a curve later on. I feel like the fact that it can only hit a beast might even be a positive on this card, because you really want it to be hitting Rat Pack or Dispatch Kodo. It means you can't really play Dopplegangster with this card, which is a bit of a bummer, but I feel like the card is pretty strong. It's just really efficient for its mana cost, and it makes the Dispatch Kodo and the Rat Pack super good. It also means that it dodges your Shaky Zipgunner when you play this card. So good cards. He's playing the Buff Hunter deck, probably. Probably not good enough outside of the Buff Hunter deck unless there's like a Beast Charger that's worth playing. Hey, you can play this in the same turn as King Crush. Hidden Cache is kind of a weird card to me. It seems weird that they put this and Smuggler's Crate in the same expansion since they're like kinda similar cards, but this one costs twice as much, so I think it is worse. It's not a terrible card, but I feel like the Buff Hunter is probably already going to be pretty tight on space, and I feel like this just isn't really a card that's going to make the cut. I also don't think that the Buff Hunter will be able to play Cloaked Huntress, probably. This card might see play outside of the Buff Hunter if you're playing a deck with Cloaked Huntress, and like none of the other secrets are really worth playing. Like Freezing Trap is probably always going to be worth it, but in some metagames, just like Snipe isn't good, Snakes aren't good, Explosive isn't good. So maybe if you really want to play Cloaked Huntress in this meta, then like Hidden Cache is just kind of like an okay secret that you can use to justify playing the Huntress. But in the Buff Hunter, I think you're probably going to have better options, so I don't think this card will see too much play. Alleycat seems like a pretty decent card to me. Any 1-drop that isn't trash is probably playable, just because 1-drops are so good in Hearthstone. It's kind of like a Possessed Villager, except you get both halves of the body up front. It's got Beast Synergy, so that's obviously good in Hunter. Yeah, I think this card is just pretty solid. There's not really much to say about it. Curves really nicely into a Direwolf Alpha, which is pretty cool. I think in an aggressive Hunter deck, you probably play this card. Next up, we have the Hunter Legendary Knuckles. I really like this card. The 5 slot is pretty weak in Hunter. They're kind of forced into playing like Stranglethorn Tiger most of the time, and Stranglethorn Tiger is like fine, but not really that good. The benefit of this card is you can trade and push damage at the same time. And usually when you're playing, actually pretty much any deck, any aggressive or mid-range deck, there comes a point in the game where you're like, do I trade, do I go face? If you have Knuckles, you just do both. This card kind of seems designed to receive Grimy Goons buffs, but I actually think 5 mana 3/7 is like good enough. If you get a buff on this card, it's obviously pretty sick. But 5 mana 3/7 is just like pretty solid. 7 health is a ton for a 5-drop. It's a pretty good Houndmaster target. Card does a lot of damage, lets you clear their board while pushing damage. Card is just super, super solid. I actually wouldn't be surprised if this card became staple in every mid-range Hunter deck. Like if you're curving up to Savannah Highmane, I think Knuckles might just be auto-include in that list. Card just seems like so good to me. Trade and go face. Grimy Gadgeteer. Giving something +2/+2 is a lot of stats. 4 mana 4/3 is not a great stat line, it's pretty easy to kill, but the opponent is forced to kill it or else it just snowballs out of control. I think it's statted well enough to see play with its text. +2/+2 is a lot. It's just kind of a matter of what warrior deck wants to play this. It needs to be like a mid-range warrior, like the old tempo warrior that played like Bloodhoof Brave, that kind of deck. Because you don't want to play this in Control Warrior, getting the buffs on your late game minions don't really matter. I guess if you landed on an Acolyte, that's pretty good in some matchups. But generally Control Warrior just doesn't use this buff that well. And Pirate Warrior wants to be ending the game on turn 4, so I don't think they really play it. But a mid-range warrior, especially one that plays like high health minions like Bloodhoof Brave, I think would be very happy to see this card. I'm not sure if that version of warrior is worth playing, when Pirate Warrior and Control Warrior are probably both going to be pretty strong, but in that deck, Grimy Gadgeteer, solid card. Grimestreet Pawnbroker is like pretty solid. Buffing a weapon +1/+1 is really, really valuable. The problem with this card is it's not always that easy to have a weapon in your hand, If you're playing Control Warrior, you're probably only playing like 2 Fiery War Axe and then either a Fool's Bane or a Gore Howl, and you want to be playing the War Axe on 2, so if you're playing this on 3, it's not that easy to have another weapon in your hand. But maybe Control Warriors can now play like Fool's Bane and Gore Howl, and then they can play a copy of the Pawnbroker. I don't think this card is really aggressive enough to see play in like Pirate Warrior, but maybe this is another card that makes sense in a like the old Tempo Warrior. If you land the effect, it's pretty strong, but it's hard to play enough weapons, and you want to play Fiery War Axe before this card. Also, it doesn't buff like N'Zoth's First Mate weapon, which is a pretty big deal in more aggressive warriors. So the card is like fine, just not really sure if it's better than other options that you could be playing in whatever deck you would want to play this card in. I think this card is worse than Bloodsail Cultist. Bloodsail Cultist is situational, but a 3-4 stat line is much better than a 3-3. It has the pirate tag, which is sometimes relevant, and buffing a weapon in play is probably better than buffing one that's in your hand. Again, you can buff like the Rusty Hook, and you can just like, if you have a weapon with 1 charge, you can kind of preserve it and push with it in that same turn with its effect, whereas the Pawnbroker can't really, so it's like a fine card, just not sure if it's going to make the cut. Brass Knuckles seems a little bit too expensive to see play to me. On turn 4, the 2 damage isn't really that impactful. If you can land the Pawnbroker buff on this card, that makes it a lot better. 3 damage is a heck of a lot better than 2. But that's like a 2-card combo. It does curve into it though, which is kind of nice. This is another card that seems to go in that mid-rangey Tempo Warrior, because Control Warrior doesn't care about buffing their minions in hand. Pirate Warrior doesn't have time to play this card. But if you can get like +1/+1 on a Bloodhoof Brave or something, or like an Alley Armorsmith maybe, that can be pretty solid. I could see this card seeing play, but it seems like it's just a little bit on the weak side. It just seems like a 4-mana 2/3 weapon on its own is just a little bit too weak. And if you're playing a deck that wants the in-hand minion buff thing, like you kind of have to give up tempo on turn 4 to play this, and I don't feel like that deck wants to give up tempo on turn 4. Seems like a weak card, probably won't see too much play. Stolen Goods. So 2 mana +3/+3 is pretty darn strong. There are certain taunt minions that are very good with this card. If you land this on Fierce Monkey, you have a 6/7 taunt on turn 3, which seems pretty good to me. It's just kind of a matter of how many taunts can Warrior afford to play. I'm not sure that Bolster Warrior is really going to be a thing, even though, man, they keep pushing it. If you can land this on something and then play it on curve and have that minion not die to like Hex or something, this card can be pretty strong. You do have to give up your Fiery War Axe turn to play this on turn 2, which is kind of bad. But 2 mana gives something +3/+3 is pretty powerful. In the right deck, this card is actually probably pretty sick, but it just seems like that deck might not quite be there. Alley Armorsmith, pretty good Stolen Goods target. I really want to call this card bad, but I'm so scared to because every other card that gives armor is seen play. Like, I think Ironforge Portal is the card that people have compared this most to. Like, 2/7 is kind of a 4-mana stat line, and it probably gives you more than 4 armor. But the thing about Ironforge Portal is, it gives you immediate armor, so you can combo it with Shield Slam. Alley Armorsmith doesn't do that. A 2/7 stat line doesn't really trade that well on turn 5. Also, it seems like Priest is going to be really strong, and man does Cabal Shadow Priest feel bad on this card. I just really don't like the card. 2/7 is such a bad stat line on turn 5. But in certain metagames, like this card is probably pretty sick against like Face Hunter, or even like Zoo or something like that sometimes. Man, it can gain you a lot of health, but 2/7 is so bad in some matchups. I don't really like the card, but if it saw some amount of play, I wouldn't be too surprised. Might be pretty good in the like mid-rangey Stolen Goods Taunt Warrior. Because man, Stolen Goods is good on this card. 5 mana 5/10 Taunt. Build your own Ancient of War. On its own seems weak to me though. Public Defender is a card that I think is actually pretty underrated. You look at it, 2 mana 0/7 Taunt, seems weak, but it's the same stat line as Doomsayer. Sometimes you just use Doomsayer as a 2 mana 0/7 hope it has Taunt, and sometimes they just kill you through it. This card is also really, really sick with Stolen Goods. If you can go coin Stolen Goods into Public Defender, 2 mana 3/10 Taunt, or I should say a turn 2 3/10 Taunt, that's absolutely disgusting. Or even if you can just like combo them together on turn 4, 4 mana, 3/10 taunt. It's like pretty solid. If you can land like any buffs on this card, even the Grimy Gadgeteer is pretty good on this card. Like on its own, this card is so weak, but it's an insane buff target. It has so much health, and unlike the Armorsmith, this card is pretty cheap, so it's easy to like combo it in the same turn or just like play it in a turn with another card to get some pretty gross tempo. I actually wouldn't be too surprised if this card saw play, but it's definitely in a buff warrior. Like, you don't want this in control warrior, obviously you don't want this in pirate warrior. Although this card could actually be pretty good in some variation of an aggressive warrior. So like in a metagame where a lot of your cheap aggressive minions are dying to weapons, you just throw down a public defender and then keep pushing face with that, I don't know, huge toad or wolf rider or something. Card could be pretty okay in that deck. Probably won't see too much play, but in the buff deck, it's like pretty sick if you land the right buff on it. Sleep with the Fishes. Even if you only hit one thing with this card, it's like kind of similar to Quickshot or Frostbolt or whatever. And 2 mana deal 3 damage is like fine. Warrior probably wouldn't play it, but this card does have the potential to AoE. Obviously you want to combine this with a Whirlwind effect. Ravaging Ghoul is a pretty good thing to combo with this card. Warrior already has Brawl. A really comparable card to this card already is Revenge. So I'm not sure that Warrior necessarily wants like another board clear like this. It seems like 2 copies of Brawl, 2 copies of Revenge are probably going to be enough for most Warrior decks. But this card is just like pretty efficient. It's another board clear. Can't really count out board clears. 2 mana deal 3 damage to everything is a pretty nice clear. You can even play it in like the Wild Pyromancer Commanding Shout decks. I think this card has potential. It probably only sees play alongside 2 Brawls and 2 Revenges though. Or maybe it'll be good after Revenge rotates out. Seems okay to me. Hobart Grapplehammer. 2 mana 2/2 is not that strong, but giving all your weapons in your deck +1 attack is very strong. Pirate Warrior tends to send a lot of weapons to the face. So this card is kind of going to be like 2 mana 2/2. Deal like 2 to 5 damage to the opponent or something. Unfortunately, this card can't buff the Rusty Hook from your N'Zoth's First Mate, but it does buff, you know, Fiery War Axe, Arcanite Reaper. It buffs a lot of the weapons that you're already playing in that deck anyway, and 2 mana 2/2 is honestly just not that bad. Even in Control Warrior, like moving your Fiery War Axe from 3 damage to 4 damage is pretty significant, lets it kill like Totem Golem and Azure Drake. Most Control Warriors right now only play like 2 Fiery War Axe and like 1 Gorehowl or 1 Fool's Bane. You might need like an additional weapon in that deck to justify playing this card in Control Warrior, but I think it could be reasonable. I think this card is almost certainly going to be played in Pirate Warrior though. Don Honcho seems like a pretty strong card to me. A lot of people want to play this on turn 7 to buff their Tyrion, but I don't think this card is really at its best buffing big minions, because those minions just like die to Hex whether or not they have +5/+5. I think the main strength of Don Honcho is if you get to late game with some early game garbage like Argent Squire stuck in your hand, you can turn your 1-drop into like an actual threat. On turn 8 you can go 5/6 Don Honcho, 6/6 Argent Squire. That's like pretty strong. A lot of people have criticized this card for being a 7 mana 5/6, but once you get to this point in the game, it doesn't really matter that your stats are like super efficient if you have a good battle cry. You just need the stats to be like big enough to kill mid-game stuff. And this card does like, it kills Azure Drake and stuff like that. I think 7 mana 5/6 is fine. Also, like all of the 7-drops in Hearthstone are garbage right now, so Don Honcho just kind of fills into a slot that's like not very highly contested. So I think this card is pretty good. I like it in decks that play like 1-drops and stuff like that, but also curve up this high. So I really like it in Paladin, because Paladin wants to be curving up to their Tyrion anyway. Not sure how much it really makes sense in like Warrior or Hunter, but it could be reasonable in those classes too. You can also do this really cheeky combo, where you go Don Honcho with Bran Bronzebeard on the board, and then you buff your Leroy Jenkins, and then your Leroy is a 16 power minion, and next turn you play Leroy along with Blessed Champion for a 4-card 20 mana combo that deals 32 damage. That's a pretty efficient 2-turn kill. It might just be outclassed by the Anyfin combo right now, but maybe after Anyfin rotates out that could be like an actual deck. Seems like a pretty strong combo to me. But Don Honcho probably also just sees play in like mid-rangey decks. I like this card a lot. Dopplegangster just seems like a really good card to me. Even if you land like +1/+1 on this card, 5 mana for 3/3/3s is like pretty solid. Anything past that is nuts. If you land Don Honcho on this card, it's like absolutely insane. You put 3 7/7s on the board for 5 mana. It's not even that weak to AoE because you only invested 1 actual card into it, although I guess you also invest the battle cries of some other minions. But this card is just like pretty good in any deck that's playing cards that can buff it in hand. And at its worst, it's a Force of Nature, which is not like the worst card in the world. This card is also pretty cool in Shaman. Combine it with Evolve, and you get 3 6-drops for 6 mana. Seems pretty strong. There's just a lot of really cool stuff you can do with this card, and I expect at least some of it to be powerful. This card could potentially be deck, maybe even metagame defining. Fight Promoter. If you actually get the battle cry out of this card, it's probably better than old Ancient of Lore, which was so good it had to be nerfed. So that's pretty nice. The problem is it's kind of hard to have a 6 health minion on the board. I don't think you're really playing this just like hoping that your Ancient of War from last turn lived. You can play it with Public Defender, or you can combo it kind of with like Doomsayer to get the draw on the same turn. But I don't think any of that is really going to be that powerful. Apparently this card actually procs off of itself if you land some Grimy Goons buffs on it and get it up to a 6 health minion on its own. So in a mid-rangey Grimy Goons deck, I think this card could actually see play. I'm just not really sure if the Grimy Goons decks are going to like have a good spot for this card. Hunter is probably going to be playing Savannah Highmane if they're curving this high. Warrior, I'm not even really sure that a mid-rangey Grimy Goons Warrior is going to exist, but that deck might be kind of tough on space because it might want to include Taunt Synergy too. And Paladin is probably going to be pretty aggressive, but if there is a mid-rangey Grimy Goons hand buffing deck, I think this card is pretty solid in it. Like, if you just assume that this is a 6 mana 6/6 draw 2 cards, that's like actually nuts. So if it's easy to get it up that high, then this card is definitely quite strong. Sergeant Sally. So this is another card that is obviously intended to be used with the Grimy Goons mechanic. The problem with these Death Rattle AoE cards is that your opponent can choose how they trade before they go off. It's the reason that cards like Abomination and Chill Maul just like don't really see play. Because you play these into a board that they can kill and they just like run their weak stuff into it, and then maybe their big guy even survives the AoE damage. Delayed AoE is just like not that strong because it's too easy to play around. So honestly, I just don't really like this card in those decks. I mean, if you can land some buffs on it, maybe you just play it anyway. You need to get multiple buffs on this card for it to be worth it in that kind of deck. And it's taking the buffs away from your other minions if you're not playing it in Paladin. I just think this card is too easy to play around if you can't kill it on your own turn. And a card that's very good for killing this on your own turn is Power Overwhelming. You make this a 4 mana 2 card 5 damage AoE combo. That's pretty alright. A lot of controlling Warlocks play Power Overwhelming already anyway to combo with Leroy, so maybe this can just be like another use for your Power Overwhelming. Seems kind of alright in that deck, not really sure if a controlling Warlock would really have room for that. Maybe this card even sees play in Zoo, in a metagame where Zoo wants a one-sided AoE for other decks. Could be okay. Most Zoo decks don't even play Power Overwhelming right now because they don't have room with all the discard synergy stuff. But I think this card is better with Power Overwhelming than it is with the Grimy Goons mechanic. So if it sees play, it's probably in Warlock. Worgen Greaser. Wow, this card is bad. If this card was playable, Ancient Shade would be seeing play. Same mana cost for +1/+1. Aggressive decks don't care about the battle cry, so card's really bad. Hired Gun. Generally, aggressively statted taunt minions aren't very good. 3 mana 4/3 is a pretty weak stat line. If 3 mana 4/3 was any good, decks other than Priest would play Injured Blade Master and they just never have. It's just not a good stat line, and taunt doesn't really make sense on a minion with these stats, so probably won't see too much play. Maybe in an aggressive Bolster Warrior you could play this, but even in that deck Fierce Monkey is probably just better, and I'm not sure that you want these on top of the Fierce Monkey, so probably won't see play. Backstreet Leper is comically bad. If you want a 3 mana 3/1 that deals damage, you just play Wolf Rider. And no one plays Wolf Rider right now. So compared to Wolfrider, it doesn't really get stopped by taunts, but it's a death rattle, so it doesn't even deal damage the turn you draw it. It just doesn't do enough damage, basically. It's too easy to kill. Backstreet Leper just seems worse than Wolfrider most of the time, and I don't think you want this card and Wolfrider. And if you want this card and Wolfrider, you just already can just be playing Argent Horserider instead, so you have to be playing Argent Horserider, Wolfrider, and this card. This card's not going to see play. Just way too inefficient. Tanaris Hogchopper. If you can assume that you're going to be able to give this card charge, 4 mana 4/4 charge is pretty good. I mean, Kor'kron Elite sees play, and this would be better than Kor'kron Elite. But your opponent's hand is never going to be empty. Even against aggressive decks, they're often holding on to Kill Command or Lava Burst or something. You're going to get the Battle Cry out of this card like 1% of the time. So you definitely just don't play this card because it's worse than Yeti in most games. Spiked Hogrider is alright. Even if you don't get the Battle Cry, a 5 mana 5/5 is okay. If you run it into your opponent's thing from below, it's pretty bad. You both lost 1 card, but you paid 5 mana and they paid 0. But like if you have a 2-drop on the board and they have a Taunt Totem, then you can play this, gain charge, kill their Taunt Totem with your weak guy, and then get 5 face damage in. And like, it's kind of fine if you don't get the Battle Cry out of this card, but you need to be getting the Battle Cry pretty often to justify playing this over even like Stranglethorn Tiger or something. And if you can get the Battle Cry off this card often enough for it to be worth it, it seems like you would be better off just playing the Black Knight in your deck. Though for an anti-taunt tech card, it seems like it's just worse than Black Knight, and it's not even good against the most common taunt, which is Thing from Below right now. So I don't really like this card. It's not unplayable, but it seems like there are just better options. Leatherclad Hogleader. I think this is the best of the 3 Hog Biker cards. 6 mana 6/6 is an okay stat line. 6 mana 6/6 charge would probably be like really OP. If your opponent has 6 cards in their hand, that's not that difficult of a condition to fulfill. Some control decks are just going to have that anyway. And if you don't get the charge, I think it's better than the other ones. It's just a vanilla 6 mana 6/6. This is definitely still a metagame dependent card, because if you don't get the charge very often, it's just not worth playing. But I think in certain metagames it would be possible to get the charge out of this card, like, I don't know, even like 50% of the time on turn 6 or something. You can also do some cute stuff combining it with like Naturalize and Cold Light Oracle in an aggressive Druid list. I don't think you really play this in like Mildred or anything, but an aggressive list that just like plays Cold Light Oracles and Naturalize, this card could be pretty okay. I don't think it'll see play, but I think it's the most competitive of the Hog Bikers, and there is at least a cute deck where this card makes sense. Madame Goya will be the last card in this video. This card just seems like really bad to me. 6 mana is a lot of mana to pay for this card, so even if you cheat out like a Tyrion or something, you're barely even getting a discount on it. And you still have to have a minion on board, so this card is situational. You can combine it with like Shaman and Paladin hero powers to guarantee you have a minion, but then this is costing 8 mana. And what card is there that's really worth cheating out for 8 mana? I mean, I guess you also get the 4/3 on top of it, but a 4/3 minion that late in the game, like, isn't that relevant? You can put certain cards back in your deck, but that's like super slow. If you try to just like shuffle a garbage minion back into your deck, then you have to draw that garbage minion later in the game. It seems like one of the best targets for this card would be Yashiraj, and generally anything that you would want to send back with this card is going to be a bad target off of the Yashiraj. So I'm just not really sure what you're supposed to do with this card. I think the only way this would see play is if there was a very specific heavy win condition minion that you wanted to pull out of your deck to kill your opponent. Maybe it's even possible that like the Malygos Shaman could play this card. They have access to the hero power. It basically puts 2 Malygos in their deck if they're trying to just play it from their hand and kill the opponent with like Thaurissan procs. So maybe this allows you to play a second Malygos in that deck. That's the only deck I can really think of that would even consider playing Madame Goya right now. But maybe someone will come up with something cute. The card just seems really understated and pretty bad to me though, so I don't expect it to see any play. Seems worse than Barnes in a lot of the situations where you could make a case for playing the card.